Hello there, and welcome back to the Closet Historian and back to my sewing parlor for another project. Now, I actually had the idea for this project a very long time ago. I originally sketched it out back in Colorado, so it must have been in September or October of last year, and I had the sketch like on top of my piles of sketches, and I put it in like a box labeled papers, and I think I actually did find it one time when I was going through things here, and then I did the fatal thing, which you must never do, which is take it away from the rest of the things and put it in a special place, never to be seen again, because I knew I wanted to make this project soon, so I set it aside, knowing I wanted to work on it shortly, and then of course, I won't find that sketch for another year at least. So then I kind of had to remember what I'd had in mind and re-sketch the idea from sort of memory of what I'd done the first time without really remembering what I had done the first time. So all I knew was that I wanted a short little jacket with this back detail, and then I couldn't exactly remember what I wanted to do for the tails in the back, but I think it was something along these lines. All I can say with 100% certainty is that I've been waiting a very long time to put this tri-colored silk dupioni to use. So let's go ahead and dive on in.
And naturally I begin with my basic bodice block, the front in this case, and some alphanumeric paper. Let me go ahead and trace that in and sketch in my original dart legs here. I, of course, will be moving these around. I will be using an angled horizontal princess seam for this design today, a style line I've become quite fond of recently. But before then, let me go ahead and tip my shoulder up and out 1/4 of an inch along the arm side here, and then dip the arm side down 1/4 of an inch as well, just to give myself a little bit more room for a shoulder pad and movement in this jacket. I will also add 1/4 of an inch of ease along the side seam here, just again because this will technically be outerwear and intended to be worn over something else. And actually this particular tracing of my block is a little bit short, so I'll add 1/4 inch to the waistline as well. Just, 1/4 inch almost everywhere. But I'm being particular about it, I promise. Here up at the neckline, I'm going to come out 1/2 inch and then up 1.5 inches as a guide to go ahead and draw in my tipped up neckline here, sort of a grown on stand collar. And then I'm going to leave this actually quite high up here, draw a little bit of an S curve over and down into the center front neckline. Leaving this a bit high like this will create a sort of standing fold back collar here at the center front, and you'll see what that means when I'm wearing the jacket later. But I can go ahead and start cutting this out so that I can do some dart manipulation. I am just going to slide this waist dart closed so I can get an idea of what the lower portion of my block looks like in order to draw in the horizontal princess seam where I want it. So I'm just transferring all of that dart fullness into the side dart for now. I will eventually close all of the dart fullness, of course, into this style line, but I wanted to determine where exactly I want this to meet at the side seam and into the center front. And I decided to come up 4.5 inches along the side seam, and then once I draw from there through the apex, that kind of determines where this is going to land along the front. Like so. So this is going to be my new style line. I will just curve the very tippy top of that at the center front here, so it's a little bit swoopier. Again, subtle enough it's probably not noticeable. And I will go ahead and tip the neckline from this point out towards the shoulder about, I don't know, less than 1/4 of an inch. It's really so subtle that I didn't really need to do it, to be honest. And I'll redraw in my seam allowance there. I do have 1/2 inch of seam allowance along my center front here, because of course I will need that in order to have my center fronts meet at the center. Once again, hopefully I'm making any sense. But this is where my new style line will be, which means this is actually where I need to swing the rest of this to close my side dart now, which of course you can still see it. Let me cut away the excess so you can at least see the side dart. So all my dart fullness is now chilling in this particular line to the apex, but instead of using this as dart fullness, I'm going to go ahead and cut this apart entirely, cut off the excess along the center front here, and then I just need to add seam allowance to both of these pieces. And we have created a horizontal angled princess seam, which again is a sort of princess seam that doesn't have a name. So we'll have to think of one, I suppose. Suggestions below. I'm now taking applications for what we should call an angled horizontal princess seam. I did want to draw in another style line here, although this one is here for just style reasons, not fit reasons. So I'm just deciding where I want that to be as well. I will have this here mostly so that the line up into the shoulder, where this hits the shoulder right here, perpendicular to the shoulder seam, can line up with the back princess seam. So you'll see that when we get to the back, hopefully. And these extra shapes will really only be seen by varying the grain lines just a tiny bit on my fabric. But I can go ahead and start labeling these, especially marking in the grain line for me. Even though the alphanumeric paper, of course, I can see the grid, which is nice. But if I'm working on the other side of the paper for some reason or whatever, I like to go ahead and mark in my grain line so I know where I'm supposed to cut it out. That doesn't mean that's actually where I will cut it out. It's just nice to have an idea of where a grain line parallel to the center front would be. But sometimes I put things on the bias, and I do that more usually for style reasons rather than fit reasons as well. But I'll just go ahead and add seam allowance onto everything and tape down my floops on the back so they don't get in my way later on. which you'll actually see I did forget to tape down some floops, and they did start to bother me, so. And I have a tracing of my back bodice block now that I can start to modify. I'll draw on the dart and then make those same modifications that I had started with on the front, adding a 1/4 inch onto the side seam, the waist seam. I'm going to add a 1/2 inch along the center back, tip out my shoulder 1/4 inch, down the arm side 1/4 inch, and up again, yes, the shoulder here. So just adding on my different little modifications, little bits of ease here, because this is technically an outerwear garment, although it's quite a close fitting one, so it's not like I could wear a bulky sweater underneath this, but I wouldn't want to either, so we're good to go there. And I did just use my piece from the front to trace on the bit of neckline here so that everything is the same up at the shoulder seam. And just to give a little bit more room here at the very back of the neck, I come about 3 or 4 inches down into the shoulder area and just angle off, add a 1/4 inch of tip outwards up here at the top of the back before I draw on the rest of my collar. And again, I just trace this from the front, and I can go ahead and draw in the rest of the shape here. I'm going to have this be rather tall with little pointy bits at the back. Dracula ribbon, as I tend to call it here on the channel for some silly reason. Do you hear birdies outside, missin'? The cat. She hears birdies. She no longer wants to sit on my lap. I have been abandoned. And because I do have a waist dart and a shoulder dart to work with here on the back, I will use these to create my center back princess seam. But I do want to shift the positions a little bit before I do that, so I have to swing them into new spots. In fact, I wish I had gone harder with this, but I'm going to move my dart over 5/8 of an inch, or 3/4 of an inch it says. Looks more like 5/8 to me. I could have gone 1 1/4 inch, I would have preferred it. But keeping the pivot point of my dart in the same spot, I'm just going to pivot each dart 3/4 of an inch to either side in order to have this back line be a little bit more on the angle. And I will draw that line in between the two darts and separate this off into a style line like so. Technically a shoulder princess seam for the back. Cut the dart fullness away. I will of course need to add seam allowance to either side of this, but I also want to draw in my additional style lines, which I'll use the front to mark where those need to be along the side seam so that they can meet properly the side seam when I later sew this together. And these are going to be quite curved, which is unfortunate because it means some slightly harrowing sewing later, just holding my breath, but such is how I had sketched it, so I guess I'll follow past me's directive here, like so. This is completely different. Actually, the style lines for this, both front and back, are, I think, different than how I had originally planned this jacket. Again, the only thing that's the same is the fabric, the fact that it has short sleeves, and then the peplum part of this. I think a lot of the rest of this style line-wise changed from what my initial idea was. And here I am moving this angle over a tiny bit more. No, you needed to go harder. Yeah. Even that subtle change. Thanks so much for moving it over another 1/4 inch. Come on, kid. Let me go ahead and tape some excess paper on here and add my seam allowance to my style line before I forget, for that would be catastrophic for me. It's just how I was trained, and there's no use changing now. There has actually been a major development up here in my office/bedroom where I am recording this voiceover as we speak, or as I speak. And that is, last night, instead of working on this video, which is what I was supposed to have been doing, I actually installed a window air conditioner unit in this room, and it's very exciting. It was about the heaviest box I could get up my stairs. I don't think I could have installed a unit any larger than 83 BTUs or whatever the heck this thing is, because I would not have been able to lift it. And my back is fine today, luckily, so I was trying to not, throw anything out. But it was worth it because now this room is air conditioned. And that is extremely thrilling, as you can imagine, because it's the only room in my house that has air conditioning. But for me and the kitties, all night long, you spend half of your life in your bedroom, might as well be able to enjoy it and not be melting. So I'm very excited about not having to go the whole summer without any aircon. And here I'm just cutting the other style lines apart and adding seam allowance. But you could probably extrapolate that much from watching my hands here. I will have to do another unit downstairs somewhere, but I can't quite decide what size or model of unit I want down there and for which window I wish to put it into, because the downstairs in this house is kind of strange in that although it is an 1890s house, which would indicate a closed floor plan normally, the 3 main rooms downstairs, like the 3 front rooms of the house, the foyer itself, the sewing parlor, and then the little living room off of that, they're all connected with giant archways, so they're kind of like a big great room as far as, the air square footage goes. So it's hard to know exactly what size of unit or units to do down there. I would just do ductless aircon, but alas, we've gotten several estimates and it's almost the same price as like it's like half what I paid for the down payment of the house itself. So weirdly enough, I don't have that sitting aside right now, and it's just gonna have to wait to some future time. All right, we have seam allowance on the back pieces. And I was laying out my fronts next to my backs along the side seam thinking, should I combine any of these, especially this little baby one down here? But I decided to keep my side seam just for the extra structure of it all. In a jacket, I feel like having a seam here, having a little bit of extra seam allowance, extra fabric in there, it almost serves not as boning, but as pre-boning to keep things nice and smooth along the side seam. Having a seam there adds a little bit more structure in my opinion, so I'm just going to keep that seam right where it is. Now I'm going to go ahead and start tracing at the very top, 10 inches of my front skirt block pattern, including the darts. I was thinking about using this as an A-line, but in the end I kept the darts for this front piece because I'm going to measure each. It comes out to 1 inch for each dart. I'm just going to create a large 2-inch dart instead. So I'm just kind of finding the middle between where the 2 darts should be and drawing in a 2-inch dart that I will use as a tuck in the end, as opposed to using the 2 darts as they are my block pattern. I will use the same amount of fullness into one large tuck. Hopefully this makes some sense for those of you who understand dart fullness. Which hopefully if you've been watching my channel for more than a couple of videos, you do understand dart fullness. And if not, I have a whole video about it. So if you want another hour-long video, this one is for you. But I'll just draw in the shape I want elsewhere here. Comes down from the center front another 4 inches or so. And then I flared out a tiny bit at the side seam, which I end up actually closing for this peplum piece, if not on the actual bodice itself. Of course, I require less structure along the side of my peplum, weirdly enough. And I was just figuring out what angle I needed to have at the top of this tuck, so I'm just going to tape on a little bit of extra paper, fold it closed how I want to in the fabric, trim off the excess, and then I'll have the correct shape at the top of this tuck. I feel like tucks are triangles and pleats are rectangular, but that probably is like a square and a rectangle kind of a situation. I don't know where the rules lie for tucks and pleats, honestly. But for the back of this, I'm going to be creating a layered sort of, not faux wrap, but kind of faux wrap. Almost a layered kind of tulip sleeve effect, but for the center back peplumish area of my jacket here, below the waist. The skirt of my jacket, as it were. I'm going to go ahead and trace my little A-line skirt here. I do have a copy of my block skirt with the darts closed into an A-line. I only have the top of that, as you can see, because that's all I need to trace an A-line skirt or to use it for doing peplums like this. And I do want to have the overlap for this back piece end right where the style line on the back bodice is. So I'm just indicating that along the waist using my pattern piece so I can make sure this ends right where I'd like. And I will actually trace the side seam in here just to make sure I have the same amount of flare on the back that I added to the front as well. And then I'll just start drawing in the swoops I want here. Again, I'm trying to remember to do this with a little bit extra so there's seam allowance kind of included in my lines, but in the end I decided I liked these lines so much that I did have to add additional seam allowance on, so we'll see that when we get there. And after I drew this line up into the waist, I realized this should meet up with one of the other style lines. So I'm again going to indicate that by grabbing my pattern pieces for the back bodice and just drawing in where those style lines end so that I can make that align with this one for the skirt portion. Hopefully you see what I mean. Now I do want to add some tucks into this back portion as well to create kind of like a puffed, again, like puffed tulip sleeve over my bum. Hopefully you'll see what I mean in the end of this. It sounds ridiculous now that I'm trying to explain it out loud. But I thought this was a kind of fun, like flower petal, little insect tailcoat situation. It's kind of a little fairy pixie jacket, honestly. Someone has started up a loud car outside. How rude. So here I am adding on seam allowance to these lines now that I've decided I like them, although I do have to taper this right here at the side seam because I traced this from the front piece and I can't make it longer than the front, or when I try and sew this together, I will run into a problem. Let me go ahead and start cutting this out. Now I do have my center back indicated on here, and that is where I'm going to add my first tuck, and then I have another tuck about 3 inches away, and that's just angled out to the hem. So I'll show you how I put those 2 tucks in there. Instead of using dart fullness for those, I'm just using added fullness. So I'll just separate this out. I want to add in at least 1 inch here, and I am actually going to layer the tip of this closed. I wouldn't do this more than a 1/2 inch perhaps, just because I only have so much extra built into my A-line skirt pattern that I can open back up like this. But I just want to open up a good, well, it's probably 2 inches of fullness at the waist to add this little tuck back here. But in order for this piece to really cup over my bum, I wanted to layer the tip closed to really create a curve back there. As you can see me manipulating the paper, hopefully you'll be able to understand what I mean. Apparently I'm really doubting my ability to explain tonight, so sorry about that. I always think it's harder to put into words what you're seeing on the screen. but some people are visual learners and some people are audio learners, so I'm trying to do my best for both. Let me just smooth off this line here, and I get all these floops that I have to tape down in the back. Oh, and thank goodness Oliver is here. But again, I held the tuck that I wanted closed and then cut off the excess at the waistline to have the correct little tip up of extra fabric there. I will once again separate this, close this about a 1/2 inch at the bottom in order to tip it open at the top. You can do this without closing up the bottom, by the way. It would just flare out the correct amount for an A-line skirt as opposed to kind of cupping over the bum a little bit more, which is what I have going on here. I set it. Once again, fold that closed, cut off the excess. I don't know why I had to have a cut there. I don't remember. I edited that a couple of days ago, probably because a cat interrupted me. There might be a few funny cuts today for cats interrupting. But yes, once I fold these tucks closed, you can see how this starts to create a little cupped petal shape here, which is really what I'm going for with this faux wrap back. And I do still have this style line here, the last curved line that's drawn up into the waist. I just need to separate that piece off and then add seam allowance. And then when I was doing so, I realized I could just add this on to the front piece instead of having to have a side seam for this peplum. So that's what I'm doing here. I've layered the seam allowance closed at the side, and I'm just going to go ahead and add seam allowance to the cut edge over here. And now this piece is all in one with the front. Again, study the jacket when I'm wearing it later, and hopefully you can see what I mean. I do still need to add seam allowance to this back peplum piece though. Over here, where I cut it apart along that style line. And again, I had indicated from the bodice piece at the waist where that style line needed to meet up. So it should all work in the end. Double, triple check things in your pattern drafting stage if you're not going to be making a muslin, which today I will not be making a muslin of this, because I've made several jackets in similar-ish styles before, and yet here I am because I cannot be stopped. One can never have too many funky little silk jackets that make you feel like the female version of Dracula. So I've closed that side seam, and then now we have the seam allowance along the back style line. These will close up, the front tuck will close up as well, and then it's quite flared right at the side seam as well. Even though the side seam is now closed, the reason I was able to close it is because it was fully A-lined at this point. But here I have my tricolor silk dupe peony from Silk Baron. I grabbed this at least over a year ago, probably. I do think I grabbed 5 or 6 yards. I'm not sure if there was a sale. Who knows what I was up to back in the past? It was a completely different person, honestly. But this is a blend of black, aqua, and burgundy, which creates this rather pretty iridescent shade of grape purple. And I did cut out the center front lower portion of the bodice on the bias. I cut some of these pieces out. They're so curved that if I cut one edge out on the straight grain, the other edge ends up on the cross grain or vice versa, so that when I sew everything all together later, at various places these sort of striations of the fabric no longer match up, which adds on even further to the iridescent effect that this fabric already has inherently going on. And this is the color Discotheque from Silk Baron, by the way, and I can link to this fabric below, although this is not sponsored. And here I have actually cut out every single piece from cotton muslin as well, and I will go ahead and hand baste each piece to its muslin backing. Although the silk is a little bit thicker than a regular dupe peony, it's still too soft to create anything tailored like a jacket out of, so I want to go ahead and hand baste every single piece using some cotton thread, waxed cotton thread here, which apparently is perfectly appetizing to Oliver because here he was trying to steal it away from me. But I just have some of that threaded on a beading needle, and I'm taking large running stitches. After I've lined up the cotton and the silk, they don't move too much on their own, but of course, while I'm sewing, I want everything to be held into place before I put actual tiny stitches onto these pieces. Once I sew the pieces together, I will worry less, but for now, I don't want my edges of the silk itself to fray, and I don't want my two pieces to separate. So I just do a running stitch along most of the edges, and then where the silk is cut on the cross grain and has like a greater chance of coming apart, I will just whip stitch those edges loosely as well, as you can see in this piece here. But just quickly basting everything together, though I guess I say quickly, it did take me an entire day of just standing here hand stitching, which at the end of it, my feet hurt. It was like doing a shift of retail, just standing the whole time to baste all these things together. I could have sat down, but it was all laying out here on the green table of grace, and therefore I decided it was a good spot to keep doing it. And yes, green table of grace, because I'm trying to give myself more, and I'm not very good at it, so I need to practice. Whereas in the past, in my last sewing room, I had a blue patterning table of doom, because I taught myself basically to pattern draft on that table, both when I was a kid before I went to fashion school, and afterwards when I kind of finished my education up all on my own despite already having a degree. Practice is the most important thing, not official studies. quite an epic amount of detail I wish to do down the center back of this jacket, and in order to do so I'm going to use a 3-inch wide strip of fabric that is, I don't know, 80 inches long. I cut a very long piece along the selvage, as you can see here, because the other side that I'm not fringing is selvage. But what I'm doing here is I'm removing the black threads from the weave of the fabric to leave this fringed edge on the other side. So whereas before I was just whip stitching things to make sure that the fabric didn't fray, now I'm purposefully fraying the fabric. And again, Oliver was here to help, as he so often is, let's face it. Especially when I have lots of little threads that he wants to eat, which is not useful in any way, shape, or form, and I have to constantly keep an eye on him and the threads. Though luckily he did finally settle down a bit. It really is lucky that he's so very precious and that he just, you know, the big problem here is that he wants to be close to me and wants to be involved in anything and everything I'm doing. But he did delay a lot about this project. But seeing as cats don't live forever, I do try and just concede into the cuteness and let him have a little moment before I can continue. I think it's probably best for both of us. And here I am going ahead and closing up some of the extra style lines. All the style lines that are here for style reasons and not fit reasons, I can go ahead and close those up and use the same exact pattern pieces to cut out my lining. Of course, I don't want to have extra seams in my lining because the fewer seams one has to sew in slippery rayon lining, the better. But for the top of the center back here, where this will interact with the collar and will be seen, I want to make sure I use the silk for that. So I'm going to add a seam and seam allowance there, and I'll do the lower portion in the rayon and use the top portion of the pattern center back lining piece be silk. And then I started thinking I wanted to go ahead and just do a shoulder princess for the front for the lining, not obviously for the silk we just cut out. Everything's all cut out now except for the lining. So I actually taped the pieces back together along the center front-ish style line here, portion of the style line. So all the dart fullness is once again hanging out in the side seam. But I will just kind of Frankenstein these pieces back together onto a new tracing to use for the lining. That way that center front piece can again be cut on silk where it will fold back and create the collar for my garment and just interact with the facing. So everywhere along the center front can be done in the silk, but I don't have to cut the entire front lining out of silk, which would be slightly wasteful, especially since I want to use the silk to make another garment later on. So I'm just really Frankensteining my lining pieces here and hoping for the best. Which, by the way, has everyone seen the trailer for the Guillermo del Toro version of Frankenstein? Because I'm here for it. I wish Guillermo would just make all the Universal monster-ish movies again. Like if there was a Guillermo version of The Mummy, I'm sure it would be amazing. And if there was a Guillermo version of Dracula, I'm sure it would be amazing. There's like a new version of Dracula every year. Why can't we just have a Guillermo one? Why not? The aesthetics in Guillermo del Toro movies are always on point, even if that last one with Bradley Cooper was not quite my cup of tea. There might have been an edit of that movie, and like if it wasn't Bradley Cooper that I would have liked, but there's just something about Bradley Cooper that I just can't get on board with. I don't know why. But yes, closing up all the dartfulness so that I have a shoulder princess for the front lining. And you may have noticed I haven't mentioned the sleeve pattern at all. It's because I'm using the same exact sleeve pattern I used on that floral sateen dress earlier in the year. I can go ahead and put a card up to that video here so you can watch how I put this very strange little origami sleeve pattern together in the first place. But I really do like this strange little structured, someone called it a tortellini sleeve. So this little tortellini sleeve, it sort of juts out at the shoulder, which is super nice for creating an hourglass figure, which is what I'm always trying to achieve with my personal wardrobe. But then the rest of the fullness, the sort of cowling that goes into the pleating of this sleeve almost looks like a puff sleeve as well. So it's like a structured, slightly more angular version of a puff sleeve, in my opinion. And of course, originally I had drawn, I think, tulip sleeves with this to match with the crossover of the back of the peplum. But in the time between when I originally conceived this jacket and now, I've fallen in love with the tortellini sleeve. So maybe that's just what we'll call these, because then we'll know what I'm talking about. It's not a very serious name, but I never said that style components need to be serious. They just need to be understandable. So if you know what I mean when I say tortellini sleeve, then it works. I'm just sewing the underarm seam of those clothes, by the way. You can see I already basted these to the muslin interlayer. And the natural color of the muslin on the inside of things does make everything easier to understand visually on camera, which is kind of nice as well. And here is my iridescent jacquard rayon lining here. And I've sewn the underarm seam in that as well. I can line those up right sides together along the cuff of the sleeve, although these are short sleeves, but cuff it remains. And this is quite the curve down here, so I do need to either face it or line it. So I decided to go ahead and just fully line these. since the rest of the jacket will be fully lined anyhow. So just match those up and stitch those over on the machine. Of course, I am using Gutermann all-purpose thread over on the machine. I'm using a size 12 Microtex needle, and I did put a fresh one in for this project. I do try and remember to change my needle for each project, unless I'm doing something absolutely tiny, then I'll keep using it for the next one. Needles will dull down quicker than you expect. I always think it's better to err on the side of a sharp new needle than to have something that might be a little bit dull. Just creates less problems when you're at the machine, and I always try and avoid as many problems as possible before they pop up. And I am using that same 1/2 inch seam allowance that I used when pattern drafting, naturally, otherwise things would be rather screwy with the fit later on. And I am using my personal standard of 12 stitches per inch here on the Singer 99K. And again, because this is so curved, I do need to put clips about every centimeter along this hem here. It's very curvy. That way I can turn this, I guess, right side out-ish. Turn this to the inside. Now you could try and do some understitching on this. It might be a little bit annoying because it's just too small of a circumference to get in there nicely. But because the outer fabric at this point, which is made up of the silk and the cotton layers, is so much thicker than this very thin lining, the lining stays pretty well tucked into the inside here. Seeing as they're cut to be the exact same size, I should have no trouble. And I will treat all 3 layers as one as I'm doing the work here at the top cap of the sleeves, so the lining will be caught up in all the same pleats as the rest, and therefore everything should remain tucked in place. And I am going to sew these little short bits, the sort of raised hooray arms of the top of the tortellini here. Hopefully, again, you see what I mean. It's pretty weird. Right sides together, line this up, like so, for both sleeves. Luckily, this lining is also very pretty to look at. This is one of the prettier linings that Mood has ever done. They do a lot of these 2-colored iridescent jacquard linings, but not nearly enough for my liking. They usually do the same sort of colors. They have like 10 colors that they kind of stick to, and I wish they would do more greens, for example, or black and green. So if anyone from Mood is listening, more of these linings in different colors. You can bring back the bug patterns though, because they had a ladybug print in red, and they had a beetle print in blue and in purple. But like, do those same things only in green. You know what I'm saying? Or like a spiderweb print. If anyone at Mood wants to have me collab on some jacquard lining, let me know. Oh my, hello. Sophia has returned. Okay, you want to come uppies? You can come uppies, Moopy. I am now once again petting a cat in the background. I would apologize, but let's face it, I'm not gonna. And when my sleeves are flat, I did put pins in where I needed to have these pleats later on, because now when I go to pinch out these pleats, it's much easier having them already indicated for me, because transferring the indications from the pattern onto a funky little piece like this would be very annoying. So make sure to do that flat. But I need to pin these little wings into place, match up the center of my sleeve cap with the center seam of the cap extension like so. Once again, watch the other video to see how this goes together, because I show you in muslin and talk you through it a little bit slower than this, and without a cat in my lap distracting me, honestly. The cats distract me while I'm sewing, and now they are even going to distract me while I'm editing, I guess. But that's right, she's extremely soft and very cute. Yes, I will just finish pleating my little sleeve cap together here. These are very funky. They are about as close to origami as I've ever gotten, especially when just trying to do a sleeve. There's a sort of little cowl fold that's created in them because of these 2 pleats up here. And I've seen versions of this with a gathered sleeve inside too. It's quite fun. I did first come across this style on Pinterest, by the way, and had to try and figure it out because it just looked too fun. I have my little tortoiseshell cat in my lap here, Sophia, and she looks like soot, or like an orange cat that's been running around in a chimney, you know? She's mostly black with little flashes of rust and orange. And when she purrs, she sounds like a little crackling fire, and she looks like a soot sprite, so we always say that she's crackling instead of purring. Aren't you? And speaking of marking tucks while things are flat, I'll go ahead and put pins where the tucks need to be on my peplum pieces here, like so. But before I actually baste these tucks into place, I will actually sew the back style lines of these. Sew these onto the rest. We have a slightly concave and convex curve going together here, but it's very subtle compared to something like a princess seam, so no big deal. Throw a couple of pins in there and stitch those together. This is still a curve though, so it will need to be clipped. And I will cut triangles out of this actually, and then press this curve open using the help of my tailor's ham. A very useful tool to have. You can, of course, make a tailor's ham out of spare fabric. If you keep your little cabbage bits, as I believe they are called. I'm not one to keep my cabbage bits. I have enough fabric that I am trying to figure out where to store it, let alone bits of extra pieces. I do keep pieces of fabric as long as they're larger than like 8 inches by 8 inches, perhaps. And actually, I'm really starting to keep pretty pieces of fabric, like spare pieces from this project, for example, aside because I eventually want to make a crazy quilt, which I've never made one before, but I think it would be quite fun to make a Victorian-style crazy quilt with the cutoffs for my projects. So now I do have a box set aside for collecting scraps to do that, hopefully one day. I'm not really a quilter, but that doesn't mean I can't become one in the future, I suppose. And with the style lines sewn in both my silk layer and the lining layer here, I can line these up and I will go ahead and just bag line the peplum pieces. And the left and right peplum pieces are still separate at this point. They will overlap in the back later, but for now they're completely separate pieces. And I will line each individually here, just pinning along that short little straight section at the front and then along the hem, and again stitching that together. Then I will clip my corners and curves and turn this right side out. This is another area where you could throw some understitching in here or some edge stitching, top stitching, something to hold it into place. But again, I'm quite confident. Luckily, both cotton muslin and silk to peony press really well, especially when together like this. They hold an edge once they're pressed really well, so I don't really worry about my lining slipping out of place in these. You know, it's very warm for you to be on my lap like this, Fee. You're like a little heater, in addition to being a crackling fire. She hasn't wanted to cuddle the last couple of days because it's probably been too warm, but now that I have the air conditioner, she's suddenly interested in being my friend again. So maybe she's happy about it, which I guess gives me some cat mom points for today. They didn't like it popping on randomly last night. It was surprising them, but perhaps they're already used to it. But I will flip this right side out and give the edges a nice press. Once again, throw in understitching if you desire. And I just will make sure my lining is caught up in the little tuck indications up here as well. And then I can go ahead and fold those tucks closed. So I'll just fold those shut the way they are supposed to be. And then I will baste all along the waist of this to hold the lining in place and to hold these tucks in place, so that I don't have to worry about anything coming undone later when I attach this to the rest of the jacket. And it will overlap like this at the center back. And now I can go ahead and start constructing the back and fronts of my jacket here. So here I have the side back pieces here. And again, one edge is very concave and one is very convex. So I actually pre-clipped this larger edge to make sure I could evenly distribute it along the curve. The thing about seam allowance is the edge of a curve is larger along the edge of the seam allowance than it is on the actual stitching line. There's math happening in there. So to kind of counteract that math, I did pre-clip this. You don't clip the full ½ inch when you're pre-clipping like this. You just clip like 3/8 of an inch instead. So do be careful. You don't want to clip actually through where the seam line will be, because of course that will ruin everything you've done up until now. And you will have to recut out your pieces, which would be extremely frustrating. Not that I've ever had to do anything like that before personally, though I definitely have. Wish you'd let me brush you, Fee. You have too much undercoat going on. My cats are so sheddy now that it's summer. They're shedding all over the place. I think I just live in a house of fur. I had one of the guys who came to give an estimate for the air conditioners. I was like, oh, I just hope you're not allergic to cats, because I would have to give all these people a tour of my house so they can measure the square footage and stuff. And this last guy said that he was. And by the time that he left, he was sniffling, because he was here for a good, 30, 40 minutes. And there are 3 cats in this house, and they've been shedding like nobody's business. And I can't keep up with it. So sorry to that guy. Yeah, that's a bummer for you. And here I will attach the next section of the back here. Still kind of side back piece, but it's a very strange looking one, with this little circular cutout down here. Again, just so that all style lines will have a corresponding line to meet up with on the front and back. Look out for these when the garment is constructed later and I'm wearing it. Hopefully you'll be able to see the subtle piecing of it all. Oh, and the cat has left us. Probably because I've had the air off for a good hour now while I'm talking to you, and it's no longer cold in here. So I may need to take a break from recording and turn the air conditioner back on. It's pretty quiet overall, but not when it has a lot of distance to make up. And right now I'm sure it's no longer the 72 degrees in here that I had it set to earlier. Once again, clipping my curves and pressing that all open so that everything is flat on the outside here. Again, these are just style or like fashion lines, not here for fit reasons, so everything is still flat at this point. Once I have it sewn together, it's not until I sew the actual princess seam of the back that the piece becomes curved, because that's where the dartfulness is hiding. Another video about dartfulness is coming. The more people I can get to understand dartfulness, the better. It's sort of like my goal in life now. But I went ahead and sewed the center backs together here. The only reason this has to have a seam is because I did add that little bit of flare over the back of the neck back here, which is quite subtle, but believe me, it is necessary. I'm going to come up 3/4 of an inch from the waist seam back here just to make sure I have that 1/2 inch seam allowance and enough ease next to it so that none of this detail work gets caught in the waist seam later on. And I will take my pre-fringed strip of fabric, that again is probably like 75-80 inches long. I needed another strip after this, so you'll need a bunch. Just make a bunch, and if you have leftover, it's better than not having enough. But I will go ahead and iron this in half with the fringes sticking out. Then I will go ahead and create twisted strips down the center back of my jacket. This is a detail you may have seen before. I know they used it in Game of Thrones on some of Cersei's costumes, though that was usually with cut leather, and they just cut slits in the leather itself to create the strips and then flip them up or down. But you can create these really cool spinal textures. I mean, at least when it's done down the back like this. I think it looks quite spinal once it's being worn, just by using strips of fabric and turning them and pleating them in different ways. So usually this is done in a smoother fashion, but here I'm introducing a little pleat to the very center of this. So I have fringe side down as I start on one side here, then I flip it, so the fringe is up here at the center, and put in a little tiny 1/4 inch pleat, kind of arrange it how I like, pin the center, and then again flip back so that fringe is down on the other side. Like so. Again, watch what I'm doing, because if you're just listening to me, there's no chance. And actually these curled or like flipped strips detailing is something you will see quite often on student work, or at least I think it was quite common when I was in fashion school. Everyone kind of discovers that you can do fun things with the strips of fabric at some point. But I've actually never used this style of detailing in any of the garments I've made. It is similar to how I've done the cicadas or bats down the back of jackets and bodices in the past, but those usually are just like, the strip is shaped into a cicada or a bat, for one thing, instead of just being left a rectangle like I'm using here. And I usually loop another piece of fabric down the center to serve as like the big knots on the spine as well, which for this, it's actually a little bit smoother than anything I've done before because it doesn't have that additional piece right down the center back. And I think if you look very carefully here at these little pieces that I'm doing, it kind of looks like a long, elegant moth or butterfly turned upside down. So like if you imagine the fringes at the center are like the fringes at the bottom of the wings, it kind of looks like upside down butterflies or moths, like flying towards my waist from the back of the neck. I don't know if anyone else sees it, but I see it. Either that or it still looks like tortellini again. Dang it. Maybe this will just be the tortellini jacket. Although wearing it, I don't feel like a tortellini. I feel, again, very vampy. And one last one up here at the top, like so. Again, just leaving myself enough of a buffer where there's going to be seaming going on, so I don't get any of this caught in any seam other than this back princess seam. And that is why I'm doing all of this at this step in the process. Let me go ahead and baste all this down along the sides, by the way, so nothing moves around. Because the side edges of all of these are going to be caught in the back princess seam, which will finish off all the edges of the strips as well, and they'll all be caught in between the layers along that seam for a nice clean finish and not having to worry about closing up all of these strips. This is actually like the easy way of doing things as opposed to when I've actually made little cicadas or little moths or little bats to go down the back in the past. And I will trim off all the excess just using my original seam allowance as a guide, like so. And now I really have removed the summer quality of this short sleeve jacket because how many layers of silk are down the center back like this? This is no longer breathable, let's face it. So I've just gone from a jacket that I could conceivably wear in summer without suffocating to something that probably is best for very air-conditioned environments or very cool evenings in summertime, if not just spring or fall instead. And though the two sides have been caught in that basting, I do still need to stitch down the center of this to hold those little pleats I put in place. So we'll just do that by hand under the watchful eyes of these two goobers. I do have a third cat, by the way. He just doesn't like jumping as tall as this desk is, so you never see the orange one up here on the table. It's very rare that he's given it a shot. He is my largest cat, and it is quite a lot of heft to heave. So I understand why he doesn't come up here on the table. It is very kind of him to not bother me in that way. Sometimes he'll come down here and yell at me, but that's fine. It's less of an interruption than what these other two get up to. But now that everything is basted into place and trimmed down, I can, yes, sew the center back princess seams. And I just want to make sure that none of these strips get caught in this in a way that I'm not intending. So there's little corners that are kind of folded into place, and I want to make sure they get caught into this seam properly. So I want to take extra care to position everything correctly, both here as I'm pinning and then back over on the machine. Hi, Boo Boo. Hi, Lupin. The orange cat has arrived, seemingly knowing that I was talking about him. Hello, Mr. Orange. Xander? Do you have to say anything to the people? And seeing as this is the style line that has our fit involved, I do need to clip the curve. So I'll clip the curve first and then clip out little triangles on the side where I need to avoid bulk as I press this open here. Again, using my tailor's ham for help with this one. Ugh, I kissed that cat and now his fur is stuck to my face. Again, they are so sheddy right now. I try and brush them, but the orange loves to be brushed. I could brush him for hours and he wouldn't complain, but the tortie doesn't love being brushed, which is a bummer because she has a lot of very soft undercoat that I need to get off of her. And I will need to do the same set of steps for the other side as well. So I'll just go ahead and pin that and carefully stitch this other back princess seam into place. And I can set the back aside for now and go ahead and start working on the bodice fronts for my jacket here. But this table is way too messy, so let me grab a bit of blue painter's tape to try and clean this thing off. It works well in a pinch when you don't have a lint roller. I feel like I've been to Home Goods like 80,000 times, and of course the grocery store, and do you think I ever remember to pick up lint rollers? No. I don't think I have any in my house, which, speaking of the cat fur situation, you know, it's not good. I go through a lot of tape, and I need to just switch over to using actual lint rollers. Once again, I have some very curvy seams on the front pieces here, so I need to go ahead and pre-clip my outer curve here and pin that down. So much geometry happening. Usually I'm just not very conscious of it, but I'm trying to explain sculpture to you, so, you know. And clipping that curve, pressing it open, clipping the triangles out, just trying to convince everything to lie nice and smooth. As I'm speaking to you right now, it is Tuesday evening, and I'm hoping I'll be able to finish this video slightly earlier tomorrow because I want to be able to paint the ceiling in the lounge downstairs tomorrow. We'll see. I still have to move some things out of there before I can open the royal blue paint that I'll be using on the ceiling in there, but I'll talk more about that in a future lounge plan video coming to you shortly. And with the side fronts all together, I can go ahead and stitch the princess seam for the front. Again, this is a horizontal, like an angled horizontal front princess seam here. So I just need to clip a little bit over the bust just because these fabrics are nice wovens that don't want to completely go into this pointy bust situation that I have going on here. I do leave a rather pointy bust shape in my patterns, and that's just because I wear things over a Bali flower 1940s pointier style bra, and so this is what fits properly over that bust shape. Modern bras have much rounder and foamy shape to contend with, which I do not like. I do not find it flattering on myself, nor do I find them comfortable. So I really stick to my Bali flower. It's not even a very expensive bra. The other options being the Doreen, I believe is the style, and the Rago long lines are quite nice as well. Anything that's more of an old-fashioned style bra usually is a bit pointier, which is why people, like if you look in the reviews for a bra and it says, this is too pointy, I look like Madonna, you found the right one. But I do need to clip over the curves of the bust so I can try and press this as smooth as possible, again using the tailor's ham and some steam to convince this to lay nicely. And once I've done the first side, I need to mark my notches and stitch the second just the same. And once I have both fronts constructed, I can go ahead and sew them onto the back. So I'll line up my style lines and like color blocking, for lack of a better term, I suppose. Here at the side seam, I was just making sure those lined up. I mean, as long as I had everything in order while pattern drafting, everything should line up, but there are times when I am off by like a ½ inch and wonder what the heck I was up to. But luckily everything matched up this time. So I will line up the side seams and then also the shoulder seam on this side and do this in 2 stages here, sewing the left and right separately, I suppose, or in different sessions at the machine. We know I like to batch process things, but now I can do less of it now that I'm using a limited number of pins at a time here in the sewing room. Just trying to keep the number of pins consistent from day to day, meaning that I haven't lost any and that they haven't been eaten by a cat, which is something that, you know, matters to me. No money in the budget for vet bills right about now, so I need to be careful. And once those are sewn, I can go ahead and press the side seam and shoulder seam open. Again, that shoulder seam has that little turned up, grown on neckline, so I will need to put some clips into that curve. And do forgive my like violent sort of red-orange tank top that I'm wearing, if you can catch snatches of that in the corner of this video. At this point, it was the hottest day I had in the house without aircon. So this was the day where I said to myself, I'm just gonna have to get some window units to survive. So luckily I was able to get the first one in up here in my bedroom, but I only own a few tank tops and they're all like unfortunate. So here I am wearing a bright tomato orange tank top, which is not my usual sewing attire, but I was definitely melting on this day. I didn't even get to try this jacket on until we finally had like a rainy, cool day here because I didn't want to get any sticky me onto this nice jacket, which perhaps is TMI, but too bad. I have to sew my lining together as well, so reluctantly here I am doing that. I had to sew the princess seams for my front pieces and for the back as well, just giving those a clip and a press as well. Again, when using floopy rayon, if you can somehow end up using a jacquard, it is a little bit better. So at least this is a patterned rayon lining. It's more fun to look at and definitely easier to sew. And I'll construct the back of my lining as well. Again, the top of the center back pieces have that little yoke of silk. That way where the collar turns back and the tips of the back of the collar tip backwards, I guess, you will see silk on the inside. Of course, you could use something contrasting, which would be quite fun to have, I don't know, red inside of a black jacket or green inside of a black jacket. I, again, wouldn't mind having the same exact jacket in black. But, you know, I'm trying to branch out and have even more jewel tones, which is, again, not that unusual for me. But this isn't green, so I get points for it being not black, and I get points for it being not green, which you will know are my two most common colors if you've been here on the channel a while. But I can start layering my peplum pieces onto the finished bodice pieces here. So I'm just going to layer those on at the waist. Just find the tuck needs to be at the center back, and it ends at the end of this embellished section along the center back. Hopefully you got what I meant earlier when we were pattern drafting. And then the other side will underlap underneath this. I didn't really care which side was on the top. It didn't really matter to me if it was the left or the right in the end, so I kind of just didn't even decide. I just did one side and did the other without even thinking about it. Again, it doesn't matter to me what side of my tail overlapped the other. Hopefully it doesn't bother you either. But I stitched that first side on, and I'm just going to stitch the other side on separately. Once again, limited pins at my disposal. Excuse you, sir. Oh, I forgot I brought up a brown paper grocery bag for them to play with up here, and now I'm going to suffer the consequences, aren't I, Oliver? They do love a crunchy paper bag. They're cats, after all. What are you going to do? Love a crunch. And once those are sewn on, this is a curvy waist seam, so I need to clip it, and then I will press it all up into the body of the jacket so that it will be hidden within the lining later on. Alright, and here's what the back looks like. Again, my little puffed petal peplum, and I do think it is quite cute. And then here are my little puffed, silly origami tortellini sleeves. So let me go ahead and put these in, matching up the underarm seam with the side seam here on either side, making sure I'm putting the front, like the front side of the sleeve forward, and vice versa. I usually leave a pin in the front of my sleeve so that I can match them up properly and don't get confused. But I will go ahead and match the underarm seam and then the shoulder seam, and then I can make the rest of the things in between fit. This sleeve pattern, for some reason, I have to double check it. For some reason, it is a little bit big in my arm side, which shouldn't be the case. So maybe I need to make my pleats a tiny bit bigger. I'll have to go back in time and double check. That's the kind of the nice thing about drafting all my patterns on camera, is if I don't know why something is being finicky, I can kind of just go back and review the footage, which is sort of a play-by-play way of doing things, funny enough. I have so many videos at this point that I can review information by watching my own videos. But once I do have everything pinned into submission, I can go ahead and set these sleeves in over on the machine, and no, this was not fun. This is many layers of fabric between the pleated sleeves and the interlining of it all. It's kind of bulky and annoying, which is why I was really glad in the end that I dropped the arm side that 1/4 inch. Just gives a little bit more room in this arm side for all these layers of fabric. And once I had my sleeves in, I went ahead and added some flexible Ridgeline, whatever, boning along the side seams in here. I cut this about 3/8 of an inch short under the arm side and above the waistline. This just helps keep things, as the youngins say, snatched. Or probably the youngins don't say snatched anymore. As the parlance used to be, at least, snatched along the side seams without having to wear a long lined bra. This helps keep things nice and smooth, no matter how many cookies you've had. Which I have 2 different types of cookies and cinnamon pretzels sitting on my desk. So I really should work on the being healthier thing. But in this dark, dark timeline we find ourselves in, a little treat goes a long way into maintaining any joy. But I am stitching this boning into just the seam allowance of each side seam. Again, Oliver is helping the same way I do when I do my costuming projects. So if you've seen me do that before, you've seen me insert boning in this same way. It just kind of gets whip stitched or loosely felled down to the seam allowance. And of course this is caught in between the outside fabric and the lining, so it's not seen and it's not felt, luckily enough. And while I was doing this, there was a Sophia nearby, and once I started waving my arms around to get her attention, she was very alarmed by my strange rhythmic dancing, which anyone would be, so fair enough. I will be closing this with hook and eyes down the center, but I will need a placket, a modesty panel as it were, behind that. So I'm going to go ahead and make one of those. Again, I have a probably 5 or 6 inch width of fabric that I folded in half and sewn into a little rectangle here, clipped my corners. And I did interface this with some lightweight interfacing first as well. And I can go ahead and press that into its proper rectangle. I really should have made this like 1 inch to 1.5 inches shorter, but oh well. It comes up a little high in the front, but tis fine. However, my 5-layer cotton shoulder pads from moodfabrics.com, I can link these below, we're going to be a little bit too large with this neckline coming out along the shoulder and tipping up. So I needed to cut them down. I cut about 1 inch off the straight edge of these. And then I will go ahead and baste my seam allowance to my shoulder here just to keep everything inside, like covering the muslin area, because this is what's going to be covered with lining in a moment. Hopefully that makes sense. And then I will tack my shoulder pad in here. Just going to go ahead and loosely stitch that into the seam allowance along the shoulder here. I need to stitch these into place with, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 stitches so they don't move around too much, but I don't want to pull too tightly and like squish the shoulder pad itself. So these are actually loosely whipped in here. I want them to stay in place, like be held in place within the jacket itself, but not too harshly. As I've said before, I don't actually have proper like tailoring training, so bear with me. That's why I always call my suits and my jackets that I make dressmaker suits, which is usually what like looser, less tailored suiting was called back in the 40s and 50s. And that's the kind of suiting I know how to do, not the real stuff. One day I'll break out the horsehair. I do have some here in my studio, but I have not figured out yet how to use it. But at this point I can go ahead and stitch my lining into place. So I'll line that right sides up along the outside of my jacket, and along the center front edge here I will go ahead and pin that along the front edges and the neckline, and then I'm kind of just like half, I guess it's like bag lining, but with the waist open, and I will sew this all into place. Same 1/2 inch seam allowance as I've been using everywhere else. Stitching from back here at my Dracula points of my back neckline to the front edge on either side. You can stitch the waistline of this closed with the peplum turned up inside the jacket and fully bagline this, by the way. I just prefer hand stitching the waistline at the end in case I need to fix anything else inside the jacket. If I've forgotten to add boning, I can put that in. I kind of like to leave the waistline for last. Sometimes I do it the other way. Sometimes I do it this way. I'm a fickle creature, all right? I am slightly worried about there's windows behind me as I sit here at the machine, and I am slightly worried about putting the window air conditioner in one of those windows because it'll be right behind me, and if it's going to be a big unit meant to cool the entire like downstairs of my house, I feel like I will freeze sitting right in front of it here at the windows. But at the same time, if I put it in a window that isn't in this room, will the sewing parlor get cold enough? Hard to say. Anyone an HVAC specialist, a specialist in window units, let me know. I've never had them before because I've always lived in newer houses that have ducted air conditioning, whereas in this house, of course, there is no room for ducting. She's too old for that nonsense. And with the lining stitched into place, I can go ahead and clip my corners and curves. And oh wait, there's a cat in my jacket. Once again, he's very lucky that he's so darn adorable. Look at this little goober. Thanks, buddy. He says, time for a break? Evidently. But I can go ahead and flip my jacket right side out and turn my lining towards the inside where it belongs, and fiddle with my corners to make sure they're nice and sharp, and press everything into place once again. You could, say it with me, understitch this, but I'm going to be doing some top stitching in a moment, so I'm not going to worry about it. I will, however, press things nice and crisply using my tailor's ham, just so that I have a little bit of an elevated hard surface above my ironing board here. Just going around all the edges. These back Dracula points, the back collar are really, really pointy and narrow, so I have to really cut it close to the edges, literally, when it comes to trimming these triangles, and try not to poke an awl through the end of them while I try and get them to sit nicely. They do have a fabric at Silk Baron, which I think is called Silk Tussa, which I think it's called Tussa. I can't remember. Or maybe it's the Shambhala. I don't remember. I'll put the name on the screen. This type of silk, they do have that in a different like weights of black. So it looks striated and slubby like this, but it's all different black silks. I think it's different types of silk woven together, and then they all take the dye a little bit differently. I believe is how that particular textile is created. And I would love to make this same sort of jacket out of that type of silk someday. I did try and make a jacket out of black moire last year. It was the moire that Silk Baron is carrying now, but it's not a real moire. It's a jacquard made, like woven to look like moire. And moire is actually an effect that is achieved, that sort of water graining, that sort of wood grain or watery effect of the fabric is created when a ribbed fabric is pressed on a roller against itself. It's not a pattern that's woven into the fabric. It is a mechanical effect that's applied to it. So it's usually a crispier, like Bangalin or something, but the jacquard that Silk Baron is offering, while very nice, is not very structured, so it's not very good for making a jacket. I did interline it, but I think I would have to interface the whole thing if I wanted it to be actually structured and smooth, like I prefer. Oliver's still interfering here as I try and fold my lining up on itself that 1/2 inch and close up the waistline, making sure all the nastiness is encased in the jacket. I actually did have to go and lock Oliver in his room so I could just finish this up. I'd been working on it for a whole week. I was ready to be done. I always say that I'm not very patient, and it is true. And once it gets to like day 5 or 6 on the same project, I'm ready to be done at that point. Especially if I haven't been able to try it on. Trying things on usually keeps me motivated because I'm like, oh wait, this is looking cool. I can keep going. But because it was too hot to try this on, I couldn't, reinvigorate myself that way. So that was a bummer. But now that the lining is all closed up and finished, I can go ahead and pin my placket into place. I had pinned it too far forward, so I just moved it down a little bit. But I'm just overlapping this, and there is a piece of that soft Virgulin boning inside the placket itself. I slipped 2 pieces in there before I closed this rectangle up, and I'm going to actually top stitch through the jacket into that boning, which will hold the boning in place along this sort of busk modesty panel, and at the same time, of course, allow me to put top stitching along the edge of my jacket itself. And I am just stitching 1/4 inch out from the edge, leaving the needle down at a corner, carefully zipping around the curves. And I will just finish this top stitching about 1 inch down the back points here. I eventually might want to add some beading onto this jacket, so I might cover up this top stitching with beads later. The beads have not arrived in the mail yet. I didn't actually have the right color of tiny size 15 seed bead, weirdly enough. I have so many seed beads, and yet the one color I needed for this I did not have. What were those odds? And I said my lining was all closed up. What I mean to say is it was all closed up at the waist. I still have one last area to close up, and that is here at the arm side. Again, not my favorite task. It's always less painful than I expect it to be, but for some reason I dread it every time. So here I'm turning the arm side lining in on itself in 1/2 inch. Again, I did clip that curve because this is a very curved area. And now I'm carefully lining this up along the stitching line where the sleeve got attached to the jacket, and then I can slip stitch this into place so that no seam allowance is seen and that everything is cleanly finished along the inside. And I did have to be careful when positioning my shoulder pads. Normally, if I'm sewing the lining in a different way, because I had to sew the cuffs of this first and line the sleeve before I set them in, I couldn't sew the lining to the lining at the shoulder seam and the arm side. Once again, if you're following along with this technical babble, good for you. It meant I had to set my shoulder pads 1/8 of an inch inside the seam as opposed to sticking out into the sleeve a good 1/2 inch, which is what I actually prefer, to have my shoulder pads extend past the shoulder to give my shoulders an extended look. But luckily, because this sleeve style has that little extended cap on it anyhow, I didn't really need the shoulder pad to extend into the sleeve cap itself. You have to be kind of in tune with tailoring to know what I was just talking about, but for the 2 or 3 of you who were following along, congratulations. I did sew my hook and eyes down the center front, did about 12 of those, I believe, and then my last step for this was to sew on some giant vintage sequins onto the center of each of these little pleated bow moth thingies down the spine. So I'm just going to stitch a row of these black iris, sort of iridescent finished cabochon sequins down the center back as a final flourish.
And here is my finished silk dupioni iridescent little summer jacket. Well, I say summer jacket, but there's probably too many layers going on here, especially down the center back, for this not to be a sweaty time during a summer's day. There are those occasions where you're going somewhere that is overly air conditioned, although right now it's the kind of thing I can only dream about. In any case, I hope you enjoyed seeing how this project came together today, and thank you as always for watching, and a huge thank you to my patrons who make my work and videos like these possible. And as always, I'll be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye!
And an extra special thanks to Alicia, Allison, AM Person, Amy, Ashanti, Audra, Cheryl, Concetta, Karina, Lala, Denise, Diana, Elizabeth, Ellen, Alona, Eloquent Silence, Fatal But Not Serious, Franzi, Haley, Jambonium, Janet, Jenny, Lainey, Laura, Lilith, Lynn H, Lynn O, Mac, Maggie, Margaret, Marie, Megan, Melody, Myrna, Michelle, Mo, Natalie, Nina, Rachamus, Sarah, Sarah F., Sean, Stephanie, Isabel, Thea, Theo, and Ula. And thank you to all of my patrons. It is only down to your incredible support that I'm able to keep doing this, so thank you.